The other day online, I stumbled upon the official program of the 1963 March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. This program was a typical one for these kinds of events, and it was really fun to see. Everything was planned out in great detail, of course. There were a number of clergy leading prayers and reading things, and then a long list of names, certainly some that you would recognize. John Lewis, Rosa Parks, Mrs. Medgar Evers, Mahalia Jackson, and of course the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. The program that we have online is from the private papers, though, of a lesser-known leader in the civil rights movement, the man who was literally in the shadows on that historic day, but who had crafted it from top to bottom. It was Bayard Rustin, whose vision was made real then on the Washington Mall. It was Bayard Rustin who inspired his fellow movement leaders to believe that they could dare to dream, that they could get as many as 100,000 people to stand with them. They got 250,000 people. It was Bayard Rustin, a lifelong committed Quaker, who insisted that the movement be one of nonviolence. It was Bayard Rustin who helped to strategize the Montgomery bus boycotts and helped to create the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. It was Bayard Rustin who largely made the March on Washington what it was. But he was never on the cover of Time magazine. He was never on the cover of Life magazine. His name does not appear in any of the official program for the march that tilled and sowed the ground of civil rights legislation in our country. Bayard Rustin was a gay man who refused to be in the closet as much as he refused to stop organizing and protesting for civil rights. Rustin made the choice to stay in the shadows that day because he did not want to chance compromising the credibility of the movement. But from the shadows, he amplified the truth and the dream that King famously proclaimed, that all people are made in the image of God, that all people therefore have the same amount of inherent worth because all people are divine creations. It would be years after this that all of Bayard Rustin's life and all of his story would be given the respect that he deserved. But with this truth known, we can look and we can say, thank you for your witness, Mr. Rustin. A few years later, in 1969, another breakthrough moment was fanned into flame by other LGBTQ folks of color. Now, police had invaded the Stonewall Inn many times before, and many times before they had done the usual sex identity checks, being sure that men were wearing men's clothes and women were wearing women's clothes. They would often arrest the transgressors. But this one night in June, queer folks around Christopher Street had had enough. Two transgendered women of color, Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera, who had show-kicked and shimmied their way into the hearts of everyone in Greenwich Village, they helped to provide the leadership that would turn the riot into a sustained movement that has never again retreated into the shadows. There indeed would be no Pride Month now if it had not been for Black folks. This truth has been whitewashed, as Chase said in his testimony, and this exposes the deeper truth that the LGBTQ movement for equal rights has far outpaced the real change and real reform that's called for by the movement for Black lives. But with this truth known, and certainly this Pride Month, perhaps more than any other, we can see more clearly and we can say, thank you for your witness, Miss Johnson and Miss Rivera. It is amazing what can happen when faithful and determined witnesses stay true to a vision over the long haul. The scene of the Great Commission, our text for today, is often painted as a grand moment on a high mountain with the awe of God all around them. But maybe it was a little bit more like Jesus preaching to his congregation of 11 in the middle of nowhere, Galilee, giving them this kind of ridiculous task. Go, and make disciples of all nations. You can kind of hear them saying, "Okay, sure thing, Jesus." But that is how God does it so often. Here are some fishermen, ones who had doubted, and apparently, according to the text today, were still doubting, some who had denied him. But they were the ones who were commissioned to do the seemingly impossible. Now, it was one thing to go to their own people and to bring the good news, but Jesus specifically tells them to go to the ones that they think aren't like them. The word nations here doesn't mean nations like we think of it. It is ethnos in the Greek, and it means people, specifically the Gentiles, the ones that you think that you are the least like, the outsiders, the ones on the margins. Here it is not passive, but it is very active. Go. You find them. Bring the witness. Bring the good news of God's love. And it seemed, I'm sure, like a daunting, kind of ridiculously impossible task. And yet, here we are, church, 2,000 years later, thanks to them. So thank you for your witness, first disciples. Know what else seemed like a daunting, kind of ridiculously impossible task? The passage of the Civil Rights Bill. Know what else seemed like a daunting, kind of ridiculously impossible task? Nationwide marriage equality. Know what else seemed like a daunting, kind of ridiculously impossible task? Anything that's ever been worth fighting for. Now, we still have a long way to go in the realm of gay rights, no doubt. There are still 29 states where it's still legal to fire an employee just because they are gay. There are still 30 states where conversion therapy is still practiced legally. But the amount of progress and societal shift that has occurred in the last 15 years is astonishing. And many of us reap the benefits of that every day. And it is painfully clear that the speed of this progress has not been seen in the work for racial justice. Bayard Rustin would likely have been a lot safer as a white gay man running in the suburbs than as a black man of any orientation running in the suburbs. Given the high murder rates of transgender women of color, Marsha P. and Sylvia would be far safer as white trans women than as black and brown trans women. Now, I've said a word up here today that I've never said from any church pulpit. I've said the word queer from this pulpit. It's a word that more recently LGBTQ folks for some time have reclaimed, and they've chosen it back in an empowered sense. And it's the younger generation, like Chase and others, that model this kind of courage for us. And just as queer folks have in an empowered sense reclaimed the word queer, I think maybe it's also time that we reclaim another phrase that was meant to be used against us, and that is the gay agenda. You see, queer people owe it to our forebears to recognize that our agenda now is to be witnesses to the truth that all of God's children's lives are precious and are to be protected. The gay agenda now must include the amplification of the voices of all Black, Indigenous, people of color, and to support them as they lead the way. Because we realize that truly no one is free until all are free. Because we realize, as Lilla Watson said, that our liberation is bound up with theirs. Now, friends, whether or not you place yourself somewhere along the LGBTQ alphabet soup continuum, the same is true for all of us. In the body of Christ, when one suffers, we all suffer. All of our liberation is bound up with that of others. We know this truth because we are committed to working for the common good. And our vision of what that means concretely must include becoming anti-racist. Now, becoming anti-racist isn't a destination, but it's a commitment to a way of being, which includes a lot of unlearning and relearning. It means being teachable and willing to see our shortcomings. It means that if I'm really on this journey, there might be things that I say and do, maybe even right now, maybe even today, that will cause me to cringe with conviction in a year because of what I will learn and see about myself in that time. I have to say, I already experience that on the regular, and I know that God meets me there and that God will meet us there too. So I say this as a white pastor who serves a majority white congregation. We do the work of becoming anti-racist for ourselves as much as for anyone else. If you were at the vigil for George Floyd on Wednesday, then you know this, because I would guess that you too felt the power of gathering with thousands of people that lined Mass Ave throughout Lexington. That you felt the power of taking a knee together for an anguishing long 8 minutes and 46 seconds. I felt that power, the power of this community, and I have felt it many times. It is amazing what God has done and is doing with faithful witnesses who stay committed to a vision over the long haul. The Great Commission is alive and well 2,000 years later. God is always wondering, can I get a witness? As a church, we have historically answered yes to this echoing question throughout our existence. From the beginning of the Revolutionary War to the creation of this church anew 152 years ago, to becoming an open and affirming church over 20 years ago, to voting to be an immigrant welcoming church 1 year ago. We have said, yes, we will be your witnesses, O God. And in return, God promises nothing less than God's own self as we do so. And remember, God says, I am with you even to the end of the age. Might there be, just might there be, others who a generation or two from now will look back on this moment in history, in this time of a 100-year pandemic, in this time of growing and expanding movement for Black lives, in this time of leadership upheaval? Will there be those who years from now look back on this time and all its pain and all its opportunity and say, Hancock Church, thank you for your witness. May it be so.